Hello. What I want to talk about today is a topic of soft framing of technological problems in technical writing and in tech journalism, which seems to be very prevalent. And I'm going to go through a few headings talking about why I think it's bad, talking about the archetypal form of the shit sandwich and how that is an instrument for reframing harms, why we do it, and hopefully ways in which we can stop doing that. Okay, motivation. Well, this is partly for my students. I see this coming up so often in proposals, in term papers, and in final theses. It just makes me want to weep every time I read a paragraph like this. I need a handful of antidepressants because somewhere a kitten is dying and the baby Jesus is crying when you write like this. It's almost always in the very early paragraphs. It's often the very first paragraph of an introductory part of a text, although I've seen it creeping into abstracts as well, where it's just kind of filler language, it's fluff. So, what we're talking about here is disingenuity, is basically lying to yourself and others in order to soften things partly, but also to appear dispassionate, balanced, to seem clever, and to make what you're writing feel acceptable. But they're all basically ways of lying to yourself. And I think it has come from a very sort of tabloid gutter press style, but it's become very popular in tech journalism and even in kind of quite high impact scientific papers. So let's just have a closer look at what we're talking about now with a few examples. I will read 3 short ones and you'll see the general pattern, I think. This one is about YouTube. YouTube is undoubtedly the internet's most dominant platform for streaming free videos online. It hosts billions of videos that people view and comment upon daily. However, and I will leave the rest of that for your imagination to fill in. The next one here is about Facebook. Facebook is now an essential part of our daily lives, and it connects us to family and friends, and is a vital platform for reaching our customers. But, and again, no need to really take that any further, because all of these articles are pieces of tech critique, ultimately. This is one on technology in general, but perhaps more about smartphones. Our lives today would be unimaginable without smartphone technology. With the convenience of always-on connectivity, the things we take for granted are always close to hand. However, so what we're looking at here are introductory paragraphs in articles which are otherwise scathing, deeply critical. Indeed, they're very good articles, in fact, which is why I've picked them. But they are prefaced with these awful, awful introductions. And so I just want to talk about, why is this bad? Okay, well, look, we have clearly turned a corner in the history of digital technology now. And things that people like myself have been talking about for kind of 15, 20 years are starting to become mainstream. So, from the writings of Neil Postman, Jacques Ellul, Ivan Illich, all of these people who were decades, perhaps even half a century ahead in thinking about how digital technology is going to affect us in very negative ways, have had a major influence on some of us who think a bit more about technology as developers, computer scientists, engineers, and so on. And the problem has always kind of been how to deal with this overwhelming, gushing, uncritical enthusiasm for technology. It's not the technology itself that is the problem, but the naivety with which people embrace it in a sort of cargo cult fashion and come to utterly depend on it, and in a very negative and addictive way. So as we're seeing these very negative issues come into the mainstream now, which scientists have increasingly likened to problems like obesity and smoking and environmental pollution. Every time that you go to tackle an issue like this and you prepend to it insipid apologetic to what is then a serious critique, it does worse than greatly weaken what you have to say. It's part of a ritual, I think, that's happening in writing. And let's kind of get to the conclusions early on. Why do we do it? Well, I think that in most situations we need, as writers, as scientists, developers, and so on, to give a nod to the very powerful interests on whose money and power our platform often depends. So anybody writing in academia to continue obtaining research grants, well, where are those research grants coming from? And the kind of wisdom is, well, don't bite the hand that feeds you, right? Because, Google are paying for this, Microsoft are paying for this, Amazon are paying for this, Facebook, and even if they're not directly paying for it, well, then they're in some partnership with you. They're in some they have people on the board of directors with your research committee and so on. So they always have their tentacles, and people are reluctant to speak in ways which would be, well, for want of a better word, just honest, just straightforward. So it's kind of like trying to do research on the toxicity of cigarettes when your university, and famously this was true in one university in America, I think it was Duke University, where practically the entire university board was made up of members who were in the tobacco industry. That was a place you just couldn't do honest biochemical or medical research, right? But now, with the prevalence of technology and the influence of the technology giants in universities and in the mainstream media, we have a very timid, perhaps even cowardly voices who are reluctant to speak out. So I hear in a lot of technical writing what is basically a second line or subtext to many bits of writing, which are underwriting a technological dystopia, if not in the absence of things that are said, but, through, I guess, what's the opposite of a left-handed compliment? A right-handed critique, It sidles up to power in subtle ways. And what it does is it normalizes, it glibly excuses abuses and human vices and deep social problems by giving them a kind of a gloss, giving them a nice, easy feeling. And to that extent, it's parochial, it's patrician, and it smacks a lot of privilege. It's often very disregarding of the have-nots. Look at the fake inclusive language. I'll just go back to that example. What was it? The Facebook one. Facebook is now an essential part of our daily lives. So in these gushing exaltations of technology, we'll often just kind of make these inclusive statements. It's like, hey, well, everybody does that, don't they? Everybody in the world has this technology because, we're all part of the lovely big Facebook family now. And that, I think, is very disrespectful to the fact that, a third of the world aren't even connected to the internet. A great deal of those who are on absolutely atrocious connectivity, so unreliable and low bandwidth. They don't have many of the advantages that we have in industrialized or post-industrial Western societies. And in the same stroke, it's marginalizing, it's disrespectful to the will-nots. Remember, in other talks, I've mentioned that the future economically is not a division between the haves and the have-nots. It's a division between the will and the will-nots. There are those people who, for want of privacy, respect, dignity, self-determination and autonomy, will not engage in certain kinds of technology. And so they're electively self-excluding. You only have to look at the tone of the recent film, I think, the Social Dilemma. I haven't actually seen it myself, but I've heard from somebody who was describing it to me yesterday, of all of the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs on there who are adamant that they won't let their children anywhere near to that kind of technology. They're not going to be certainly not going to let them go on Facebook or have smartphones. Well, this portends my generation, my kind of digital vegans, and those of us who choose not to do things like that. I don't have a smartphone, have never had a smartphone, and intend never to own one. This is and I think it's much more than a subculture now. It's an emergent counterculture that I hope will become huge and really challenge these problems. But, when you make these fake inclusive statements about our lives, it's so parochial. It's Stepford Wives talk. Okay, let's go on to talk about the archetypal form of this, which many of you will know as the shit sandwich. Why do we call it a shit sandwich? Well, it's it's two delicious slices of bread with the hidden payload in the middle there. The pattern is very simple to understand. You have an enthusiastic and very overly positive introduction. It's gushing, it's over familiar. And then you'll have and you see the conjunctive, right? This but, however, and then here comes the payload, which is generally bad news or some vicious criticism. It's a rejection of some kind or a disciplinary notice, or basically telling you you're going to be fired, or, you didn't win this contract, whatever. And then we have the third layer, the last piece of bread, which is conciliatory, it's polite, often even humorous ending to soften the bad message of the payload. And that in itself is often used as a vehicle for a piece of mimetic malware. It often absolves the writer of responsibility by appealing to authority. It is regrettable that I was unable to do anything. It's abdicating responsibility, or ending on a note of false optimism. We wish you the very best of luck with this project in the future, or we hope to have to do business with you again. Or it engages in some kind of minimization and a cavalier kind of way of endings to say, this doesn't really matter very much. Don't worry about it. It's all just business, mate. So there's the typical form, like the shit sandwich: enthusiastic, positive introduction, nasty payload, and then conciliatory ending. And so, what is the shit sandwich? Well, it's a way of soft framing. It's a way of reframing harms. And the harm is obviously, what's delivered in the payload. It's become such a pattern, such a trope, that we almost immediately begin our writing like this in so many ways. And whenever we feel that we have a difficult message, whenever we feel that what we are saying is perhaps controversial, it's challenging, the very first device that we reach for as writers is to use a soft reframing. And to make it obvious, hopefully, how ridiculous this is, let's just look at some examples where it obviously can't or doesn't work. Okay. What about robbery? Mugging, sticking someone up in the street with a knife. Okay. Street robbery is a convenient and accessible wealth redistribution model for those without work or morals. However, who's going to try to reframe a crime like street robbery by, first of all, pretending an apologetic to say, it's not all bad, right? Some people, they need to do street robberies, don't they? And for them, it's very convenient if you haven't got a job. So let's kind of start with a nice soft introduction there. Let's not be too hard on street robbers, right? Because everyone's got to make a buck, right? All of the dead and maybe street robbery is not such a great thing, I'm not going to give any more examples because I'm sure that one hits it home well enough. There are some interesting ones, and the reason I want to kind of move into a grey area now is to show why that example is obviously absurd, but at the same time we still continue to use soft framing of objectively atrocious and awful things without really thinking about it. So let's take pornography. I spent a lot of time working with secular humanist organisations, with people who considered themselves extraordinarily progressive, and I certainly took on board a lot of those ideas. I was very, very convinced by those arguments. I certainly held them myself for some time, and still do in many, many cases. Rational, sceptical humanism is at the core of my philosophy. Right, but, there are some ideas within that way of thinking which I think fall in nicely into this grey area. And one of them is the defence of pornography. And many rational humanists would say, this is a victimless activity. Anyway, here we've got an issue that I would say in any sample of fairly intelligent people, you would get a significant amount of disagreement on. I think if I took 100 random people from my own social circle, people that I know, half of them would probably support the idea that, if people want to look at pornography and it involves consenting subjects and it's not doing anybody any harm, right? It's giving people the relief that they need and perhaps the fantasy that they need. And another half of people would say, no, this is really awful. It's exploitative. It has all of these side effects. It leads to human trafficking. It leads to mental health problems. People overuse it and so on. Okay, there's a nice debatable subject. And you could use that as an example of something about which, in order to write controversially on it, you would have to offer some kind of balance. So you would need to lead critique, perhaps with some of this apologetic, with some of this kind of soft framing to say, hey, basically, I get these issues, right? I understand that this is not cut and dried, that this is going to need a sensitive treatment, and therefore I'm going to kind of soften this for those who might feel offended by what is about to be said. And I think that is an example of a legitimate use of soft framing. And the reason is that in the context that it's being discussed, people differ quite widely, perhaps, in their understanding of the issues. Okay, let's take another example, and in this example, what has changed is not that people are divided in the present about their thoughts and feelings, but that a more general consensus has changed in time. We don't believe the things today that we used to believe. So, we could be thinking about like witchcraft or, some kind of old superstitious belief, but it doesn't have to be something as crazy as that. Let's take a piece of science like asbestos. That's a mineral that used to be used everywhere in roofing, in insulation materials, all kinds of engineering, brake pads, things were manufactured from asbestos. And the science eventually turned out that this is really dangerous stuff. It creates all kinds of lung diseases and skin problems and stuff. So asbestos is a banned material now. But you don't have to look far back in history in terms of even electronic media, of advertising, of scientific writing, to see that in the 1940s, I think perhaps, and early 50s, this was considered a wonder material. It was considered a fantastic asset to technological progress, all of these fantastic things that could be made from asbestos. And you can read advertising literature or scientific papers which all extolling the virtues of using asbestos. Now, if you were writing about that today, it would be very hard not to have to frame it in, shall we say, you are proposing the use of it in some niche engineering application. So you might have to say, well, despite the dangers of asbestos, despite the terrible track record, however, in this case, we would like to propose, engineering these parts from asbestos material. Or let's pick something else, something that's going to cause people a lot of problems thinking about it, and it needs to be soft framed in a way to make the discussion even together an even palatable entry point into the discussion. So perhaps we're talking about mandated vaccination or something. Wow, there's a lot of people right now who could see that could be both a necessary step for the economic and social recovery of Western civilization, and at the same time is deeply, deeply problematic and disturbing. It has all kinds of rights issues attached to it, and that you would have a massive outcry of people saying, oh, we can't possibly have any program of mandated vaccination. So then, your writing would almost certainly come in with this soft framing introduction, despite the many political, philosophical problems attached to the idea of mandatory social medicine, etc., blah, blah, blah. However, and then going to present your study that shows, you'd have to achieve a baseline of like 93% inoculation or something in order for it to work. That again would be an acceptable context for this kind of soft framing as a way to make a message hearable in order to give the message a necessary reach. But what I'm saying about the use of this soft framing in technology writing is that it's doing neither of those things. It has no excuse. It has no legs to stand on. And it is gratuitous and it's nauseating. And I think it does those who use it in their writing a great disservice. So one objection, straight off the bat, is that when we talk about something, it's an essential part of our lives, and we have this very kind of overly inclusive, folksy treatment of things. If you want to look for an historical precedent for that, just look to the National Socialist Party of the mid-late 30s. That kind of Volks language, this us, all of us, we can all agree that, any right-thinking person knows that. We all understand when I say that. That kind of pernicious inclusivity is always a prelude to creating an outgroup. Okay, I'll say no more about that because enough said. Another way that it does the writer a great disservice, when we use a phrase like, our lives are unimaginable without, well, what that says to me is that maybe you have a very poor imagination, but speak for yourself. I don't want to know about your lack of imagination. I'm quite happy with my horizons, and I can tell you very much that it is not that limited. I can perfectly well imagine a world without smartphones. Do you know how? Do you know why I can imagine a world without smartphones? because I fucking lived in one for 30 years. And really, it wasn't some kind of pre-Hobbesian, every man for himself, stabbing each other with sharp sticks to get a piece of food. We weren't groveling around in the mud when we didn't have smartphones. So more seriously, as a philosophical perspective, anything that has happened can happen. And therefore, to talk about anything from the past versus something from the present in a parochial frame, to say that it's unimaginable how we could not have X, Y, or Z, is to be, well, firstly, profoundly ignorant of history, and to not see quite simply that anything that has happened can happen. And there are two other words which I pick up on several times in Ethics for Hackers and in Digital Vegan: ubiquitous and inevitable. Those are words which seem to infect every recess of tech journalism, any kind of writing about technology. First of all, to call something ubiquitous, first of all, is dishonest, because it's as we've looked at from the peak smartphone research data, ubiquity is no longer, we no longer have growth, which is pointing towards that kind of ubiquity at all. And despite manufacturers, Apple, desperately trying to put the next model into people's hands every year, we've definitely gone past that equilibrium point, perhaps even the tipping point now, because I think the decline will be rapid for environmental reasons to do with rare earth metals and slave labor in the manufacture of a lot of these consumer devices. That ubiquity is not where we're going with that. If anything, the protocols, the markets, the software, the ecosystems are fragmenting. They're undergoing fragmentation now. But the sense in which people use the word ubiquity underwrites and normalizes monopoly. It underwrites and normalizes monocultures. It normalizes lockstep thinking. And again, it kind of has all of the hallmarks of totalitarian thinking. It tends to amplify those values. So I would be very cautious about using the word ubiquitous, almost as an invisible qualifier to any time you talk about technology. Same with inevitable. You can often see an almost invisible adjective, an invisible qualifier in front of the word technology in so much writing, which is inevitable technology or ubiquitous technology. And I think neither of those conditions necessarily or hopefully hold in our future. And the word inevitable is itself a call to the intellectual cul-de-sac of technological determinism and a rejection of progress itself, because, if you have followed what I've been writing in Ethics for Hackers, and this is really just Lewis Mumford repackaged, as Andrew Kimbrell says, I'm the same. Everything's stolen from Mumford. He was just a genius 50 years ahead of his time. But to a certain extent, it's also Herbert Marcuse. This normalizing of technological determinism is anti-progressive, right? It's anti-scientific, because what it's saying is the one thing that we don't have any control of is technology, which is profoundly ironic, because the project of a technological society is essentially one of control. And so there's this schizophrenic paradox there right at the heart of technology, where on the one hand, we desire technology because it lets us control the world. And on the other hand, the one thing which is absolutely, or we claim is absolutely out of our control, is the development and evolution of technology. And of course, that point of view is a very convenient thing for us to believe for the ruling classes, for those who dominate and control through technology. The idea that our technology is out of our control sits very nicely for them. So bringing it back to this issue of soft framing properly and why we do it. One thing that I think pervades modern writing, journalism, blogging, whatever, is this false idolatry to the god of balance, as if such a thing could exist. The myth of balanced writing. We're always told when we're kids, you should proffer many points of view, and you should try to make this very inclusive, and you could always make sure that different viewpoints are represented. Look, no. As a writer, even as a scientist, you are under no obligation whatsoever to write in a balanced way about anything, right? You're not. You have innately in any work an agenda, for want of a better word, right? Every work carries a telos. It carries an agenda. It is towards something. And that's even before you bring in the ego, the humanity, the subjectivity of the writer. Yeah? So you have a project to discover a new antibiotic. That's a medical project that has built into it an agenda of saving lives, of curing illness. And in many cases, it's simply disingenuous. It's fake to try to offer a balance against what it is that you're trying to achieve in that written work. So to take that previous example, how ridiculous would it be to kind of say, despite the fact that world population is approaching a catastrophic level, and wouldn't it be great if basically like a couple of billion people would die? However, we have this new antibiotic that can basically, eliminate 50% of the world's illnesses. No, that would be ridiculous that you felt that you needed to balance a project that was, imminently good in that way. It doesn't need a justification. It doesn't need contextualizing. It doesn't need balancing, right? And so I think the same can be said for negative projects too. And then particularly when we come to critique, and we have to say, look, guys, we are facing serious problems with digital technology now. We have serious issues against democracy, against free speech, against privacy, against autonomy and dignity, against the right to repair, against the right to read, against the right to educate ourselves. To then feel that we somehow have to preface that with apologetic and say, despite all the wonderful and marvellous advantages of technology, yada, 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 shit sandwich, and then kind of trail off into this nebulous, balanced ending, which often kind of includes things like, perhaps if the government might just give a little bit more money for doing research in this area, we could reach some kind of agreement with these mega corporations. Maybe they could self-police themselves. Or maybe we could kind of come up with some nice ad blocking software which gave people meaningful choices, and you end up on these pathetic, weak conclusions, which, even the writer themselves knows that's never going to happen, right? Common political sense tells you that. And so we end up with a lot of writing in technological critique, which is flaccid and limp and really it has no punch. So, okay, guys, that's it. Stop doing that. If I read one more introduction that excuses a multitude of sins before saying, however, I think that's where I'm going to stop reading.